This is Left Hand. This is Left Hand, and I am your host, Sarepti, aka Craig, of the Acid Horizon podcast. The discussion that I would like to involve you in today is one that I've been meaning to do for a while and spans many different little pieces of writings and little projects that I've been working on. And true to the nature of the discussion, my ideas and my work on this has been so fragmented that I have put myself under undue stress in putting this particular episode of Left Hand together. And as I said, part of the reason is the topic itself, which is Dionysus, a figure who is himself or themselves scattered, dismembered, fragmented in various parts. And one of the thinkers and scholars that I wanted to focus on for this discussion is somebody who's probably not well known outside of the realm of depth psychology, and maybe even those within depth psychology don't know this person's name. It's Rafael Lopez Pedraza. He was a contemporary of James Hillman and somewhat of a dissident depth psychologist in his own right. Perhaps not as radical as Hillman was, depending on how you look at things. But he is someone whose Dionysian leanings are very much like James Hillman's in the sense that he believes that psychological explanations or archetypal reductions do not exhaust the kind of encounters that we have with Dionysian impulses. Lopez Pedraza has authored a book entitled Dionysus in Exile, whose publishing date reads as the year 2000 online. The edition that I'm working with says 2018, published by Chiron Press. And sadly, if you are a PDF hunter, you will be hard-pressed to find it, or at least I was. I have a hardbound copy of the book. I had heard about this book for a long while, and it was only about 2 years ago that I finally acquired it and finally dove into Lopez Pedraza's work, who, as I understood it earlier, was a big influence on James Hillman, even as a contemporary. It could be argued that Hillman's concept of sticking with the image comes from Pedraza himself. In fact, I believe that is a line that we're going to find in Pedraza's work, despite the fact that it's an idea that we often associate with James Hillman. Another reason that I wanted to pick this book up in 2025 is because I was recently on an episode of the Nietzsche podcast hosted by Keegan Kjeldsen, where we discussed Anti-Oedipus, David Lynch, and David Lynch's film Eraserhead. And in the final moments of the recording, or maybe even after it, I had mentioned that I was going to be focusing on Pedraza's book, Dionysus in Exile, and the question of whether we need more Dionysus in our lives. Dionysus and the myth of Dionysus conventionally is often associated with, well, Dionysus is the god of wine. He's the god of revelry, excitement, and excess. And all of those things are true. But one of the things that Lopez Pedraza emphasizes is that there are multiple dimensions to Dionysus. Well, of course, that's who Dionysus is. But one of the things that Lopez Pedraza focuses on in particular is a distinction between the mainstream Greek religious view of Dionysus and the Dionysus that we get in the Orphic myths, the narratives that emerge out of the cults of Orpheus. And while it is true that some of these aspects of Dionysus have been well understood by folks who are working in the tradition of continental philosophy, particularly if you're following the work of Nietzsche, Bataille, Klossowski, and Deleuze, you will see inflections of the Orphic understanding in their work. But one of the things that really stands out to me and Lopez Pedraza's work is the figure of Dionysus as a figure, and this is going to be odd, of stillness and calm. And so we must remember that Dionysus is a figure full of paradoxes, overladen with ambivalences. And that is one of the things that I would like to dive into here today And as I go on to explicate some of the emphasis in Lopez Pedraz's work, I would like to bring in figures like Nietzsche and Deleuze to shore up an argument for Dionysus as being a figure who is more robust and more in tune with these sublime forces, in addition to the party-hard figure of excess that we know Dionysus to be in popular culture. And at present, next week, I have a tentative meeting with Keegan from the Nietzsche podcast, whereupon we will dive deeper into this discussion of how Dionysus might truly be in exile in our society in 2025, and how our disparate understandings may be conflicting in some areas, or maybe even completely complementary. Anyway, it should make for an interesting discussion. But before we proceed, I just want to say thank you to everybody who's been listening. If you have been a supporter of Left Hand on Patreon, I am truly grateful. If you enjoy these discussions and you want to hear more like them, hop on over to the Patreon account while you're listening and subscribe at the $5 level. It's a great way to support. Okay, as we get started, one thing that we need to do is talk about the myth of Dionysus and get everyone on the same page. Now, when discussing the myth of Dionysus, we would be remiss not to note that there are a multiplicity of narratives that describe the birth of Dionysus, his being lured in and torn asunder by the Titans, and then his subsequent rebirth. And as I said, this multiplicity of narratives is quite apt because what it does is emphasize the fluidity and ambivalence of the Orphic tradition, which, in a very Nietzschean and Deleuzian vein, leaves the myth of Dionysus open to a multiplicity of interpretations. So let's begin with the birth and the identity of Dionysus. So in the Orphic tradition, Dionysus is typically described as the son of Zeus and Persephone, which sets him apart from the Olympian Dionysus, whose mother is usually identified as the mortal Semele. However, it is also true that the precise nature of this Dionysus, who is sometimes referred to as Zagreus, remains uncertain. The name Zagreus does not appear explicitly in preserved Orphic texts, but it is associated with Dionysian myths and later sources, particularly in Nonnus's Dionysiaca, a text from the 5th century. However, it is also true that others argue that the Orphic Dionysus and Zagreus are functionally interchangeable. Dionysus is the divine child of Zeus and is sometimes depicted as the rightful heir to Zeus's cosmic rule. Zeus entrusts the young Dionysus with divine symbols of power, such as a thunderbolt, which reinforces his future sovereignty. Yet, this divine favor also makes him the target for the Titans. The Titans resent Dionysus' potential dominance in the future, and in some versions, Hera, Zeus's wife, driven by jealousy, incites the Titans to destroy the child, introducing another layer of divine conflict into the myth. The dismemberment of Dionysus is one of the most violent moments in the Orphic mythology, and maybe even in all of mythology itself. But the details of the Titans' attack on Dionysus may vary significantly depending on the sources that you look at. So a common version of the Dionysus myth states that the Titans had disguised themselves in white chalk or gypsum, and they approached the child while he was playing and tried to distract him with a series of toys, such as a mirror or little dolls or knuckle bones, a game popular at the time, or a golden ball. I guess you could say this was an ancient variation on the jingling of keys. And it is actually right at this moment in the myth that we are able to bring in figures like Nietzsche or Deleuze to talk about the risks engendered by the lure of representation. Consider a mirror or a golden ball, or something shiny for that matter. It's going to be a surface upon which one's reflection will be reflected back at them. And it is in virtue of the awareness of this reflection that the process of individuation or a kind of subjectivation begins. However, just to head off some criticisms, this is not necessarily a bad thing in the context of the myth and any attendant interpretations that we have regarding human psychology or the politics of individuality. This reckoning with the appearance of oneself as a subject is fundamental to the unleashing of Dionysus's powers later on, as we will see. In any event, once the Titans capture Dionysus, they tear him apart limb from limb in an act of primal violence. And in some of the accounts, they actually boil and roast his flesh, suggesting a kind of sacrificial or cannibalistic ritual associated with the destruction of Dionysus. And the significance of this act has been widely debated, but one of the predominating interpretations is that it symbolizes the fragmentation of a divine unity into the material world, or a fundamental moment of disorder and suffering that will then necessitate a later cosmic restoration. As I mentioned earlier, there is a distinction to be made between mainstream Greek religion's understanding of the figure of Dionysus and the role of Dionysus in Orphic myth, who is sometimes associated with salvation and redemption. There are even ambivalences in the dismemberment narrative. One of the keys to Dionysian thinking is evacuating notions of finality. And so even with the dismemberment of Dionysus, there are some myths that say Athena had actually rescued Dionysus's still beating heart and preserved his essence. Other accounts say that Rhea, the mother of the Olympians, was responsible for his salvation. Nonetheless, the salvaged heart image becomes the key to his eventual rebirth, either through Zeus swallowing it or through its implantation into Semele, which then leads to the figure that we commonly know as the Olympian Dionysus. Now, once word of this brutal dismemberment gets back to the ears of Zeus, he goes about seeking revenge for the Titans' violent crime and unleashes his wrath upon them, striking them down with a thunderbolt and reducing them to ashes. And it is from these ashes that humanity is said to be born. And this aspect of the Dionysus myth introduces one of the most profound Orphic doctrines, which is the legacy of human beings involves both the divine spark of Dionysus, as he was set to be the inheritor of Zeus's powers, and the violent, corrupted nature of the Titans. And so this dual inheritance explains the Orphic emphasis on things like purification, ascetic practices, redemption, and salvation that I talked about earlier, that humans must strive to overcome their titanic origins and reclaim their lost divinity through sacred rites and philosophical contemplation. And once again, true to the spirit of this discussion, not all of the ancient sources explicitly mention this origin of humanity. Some scholars argue that this interpretation is a later Orphic innovation designed to provide a theodicy, an explanation of human suffering and moral struggle pegged to a redemption narrative. And ultimately, this sort of dialectical view of Dionysus, imbuing Dionysus with a theodicy, is going to be challenging when introducing those particular narratives to a figure like Nietzsche or even Deleuze. But as we will see, both Nietzsche and Deleuze underscore the importance of a kind of transformation that unfolds from an evacuation of titanic or heroic impulses and the embrace of a more ludic or playfully affirmative image of Dionysus. So with that said, Dionysus' dismemberment does not mean that he is truly dead. In Orphic theology, his rebirth actually marks the return of a divine unity and the promise of spiritual regeneration. Depending on the version of the myth, his resurrection is either literal, as he is restored in full, or it is merely symbolic of his essence persisting in humanity, awaiting realization through Orphic initiation and through Orphic practices. And so this cyclical structure mirrors rhythms of nature, the growth of vegetation, and the human soul's journey through multiple incarnations. And of course, this is something not unfamiliar to a narrative that we see in Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. But of course, there is yet another paradox or ambivalence that haunts the Dionysus myth, which is that some of the traditional cults see Dionysus not as a figure who does not die, but as a liminal figure who stands between life and death. And so we might say for some of the Orphic tradition that Dionysus becomes the centerpiece of a radical metaphysics. And for those of us in the modern era, Dionysus has become a figure that evinces a tension between fragmentation and unity. Or in the case of depth psychology, Dionysus could be seen as an allegory for the soul's exile and its return. For someone like Gilles Deleuze, who we will take a look at a little bit later, the figure of Dionysus, as we see it in the marriage with Ariadne following her exit from the labyrinth, embodies this virtue of sloughing off the burdens of the nihilistic hero and instead engendering an attitude and spirit of play. And so now that we have a general sense of the myth of Dionysus, well, I should say we actually have a multiplicity of myths in mind, and we can take them wherever we would like to go with them. But I would like to go back to the beginning of this discussion where we talked about the contradictions of Dionysus, particularly the one pointed out by Rafael Lopez Pedraza, which is Dionysus as a figure of stillness. Now, remember that Lopez Pedraza is a depth psychologist who started in the Jungian tradition and remained in it, but was somewhat of a radical, insofar that he's associated with an innovative view of Jungian psychology, often called post-Jungianism, even though he might disagree with that term himself. Lopez Pedraza and his contemporaries are pulling from scholars of mythology, such as E.R. Dodds and W.C.K. Guthrie. And in Dionysus and Exile, he pulls heavily on both of them, but particularly the latter when he talks about the figure of Dionysus as a figure of stillness. And since this book is not available online, let me just read a passage from it. Lopez Pedraza writes, quote, "Among all the contradictions contained in the Dionysus godhead, there is, quote, an uncanny stillness and stillness and calm too are among the gifts he bestows, end quotes." Lopez Pedraza continues, quote, "Scholars have mostly concentrated on the frenzied aspect of Dionysus and have neglected this, quote, stillness and calm, end quote. But it is a basic aspect. As we proceed with this study, let us keep in mind this gift of the god, for it is necessary to the psychotherapist's sense of his or her own body. The art of psychotherapy lies in the constellation of incubation, with its uncanny stillness and calm, so fundamental to the therapeutic situation." I would like to reformulate this observation in a way that is equally paradoxical, but in a way that I think will also illuminate what I believe is one of the big stakes in reclaiming Dionysus: active repose. Consider for a moment from the standpoint of somebody who feels a kind of nagging tension within them, this impulse perhaps to do something like psychotherapy, for instance, or that something is fundamentally wrong and they want to address it, but they are carried on by the inertia of life, especially in a way that emphasizes the sort of frenzied solipsism that we experience in modernity and under capitalism. One thing that embracing the intention to do something like therapy, meditation, to undertake an artistic project, or anything for that matter, any impulse or at any instance in which we feel as if we are overwhelmed by this tension and we need to interrogate it deeply. Creating the kind of space in which we can realize a certain or important transformation in the Dionysian way involves short-circuiting all of those determinants that leave one in that sort of frenzied state, or in a state of helplessness for that matter. But I think the implications for a Dionysian stillness and calm are far-reaching. We can think about it in terms of, well, if you've been listening to Left Hand, we could think about it in terms of the inoperativities that we see in the work of Blanchot or Agamben, for example. Thus, we might say there is a Dionysian aspect to an active embrace of a kind of inactivity, leaving aside those high-minded heroic tasks, which are often threaded through with a kind of nihilism in which one believes in the salvific capacity of a burden. In other words, how many people think that they will be saved simply by the modest heroic acts that they undertake, while all the while leaving in place all the things that make them suffer and also make them fail to enjoy or appreciate life? But personally speaking, I think there is a risk in reducing Dionysus to a kind of self-help program, because Dionysus's stillness and calm is one that is gestational. It points to a kind of incubation of an ongoing transformation or a becoming that demands a withdrawal from action. And so you might see why someone like a psychotherapist would really cotton to the idea of a Dionysian stillness. But I would argue that a Dionysian stillness isn't a kind of checking out. In fact, I believe that a Dionysian stillness invites a kind of turbulence. It may even overwhelm us and put us at risk existentially. And this is an idea that isn't without precedent. In fact, the notion of turbulent repose is something that we find in Nietzsche's work, and in many places. But before we look at Nietzsche, one of the things that I need to flag up is the overlap between the image of Dionysus and the image of the god Pan in certain aspects of Greek culture and myth. The god Pan and satyrs in general are sometimes seen as a kind of rural or local instantiation of the god Dionysus. It is also believed that Pan is part of the carousing retinue of Dionysian revelers. And so with that said, let's first turn to a passage in Nietzsche's The Wanderer and His Shadow, and let's see what Nietzsche has to say about turbulent repose. He writes, "At noontide, he to whom an active and stormy morning of life is allotted, at the noontide of life, feels his soul overcome by a strange longing for a rest that may last for months and years. All grows silent around him. Voices sound farther and farther in the distance. The sun shines straight down upon him, and on a hidden woodland sward he sees the great god Pan sleeping, and with Pan, nature seems to him to have gone to sleep with an expression of eternity on their faces. He wants nothing. He troubles about nothing. His heart stands still. Only his eye lives. It is a death with waking eyes. The man sees much that he never saw before, and so far as his eye can reach, all is woven into and, as it were, buried in a net of light. He feels happy, but it is a heavy, very heavy kind of happiness. Then at last the wind stirs in the trees, noontide is over, life carries him away again, life with its blind eyes, and its tempestuous retinue behind it, desire, illusion, oblivion, enjoyment, destruction, decay. And so comes evening, more stormy and more active than was even the morning. To the really active man, these prolonged phases of cognition seem almost uncanny and morbid, but not unpleasant. So we can see in this passage how Nietzsche points to a kind of sublime rest, one that's paradoxically infused with its own kind of struggle and agon of impulses. And one of the things that's important about this Dionysian repose is that it does not culminate in a comfortable integration of this turbulence. In fact, there is a kind of emotional excess which resists being integrated in the wake of this kind of experience. From the standpoint of Jungian psychotherapy, I think this is problematic because Jung believes in a fairly strong version of a kind of monotheistic individuation. But what we see here is more like a differentiation through which not everything is fully metabolized by an individual. In fact, when we think of the god Pan, one of the images that comes to mind, well, is of course what Pan is associated with, which is panic, this sort of creation of radical discontinuities and seeming chaos. Pan unsettles the discreteness of objects in the universe. He makes explanations impossible. And in fact, the time of day that is associated with the god Pan is noon. And the significance of noon, of course, is that the sun is at its highest point, and it's the moment at which the body and its shadow are conterminous with one another. And as we saw in Nietzsche's The Wanderer and His Shadow, and we see again in Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra, noontide, or simply noon, is not only Pan's hour. This is the time when Nietzsche, or Zarathustra, sleeps. It is a paradoxical time of both non-activity and utter turbulence. And it seems that Nietzsche makes a distinction between various kinds of rest, particularly in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. There is a kind of rest, a kind of sleep, a kind of repose, into which we allow ourselves to be lulled into a place where we are divorced from our powers. Sleep becomes an escape from reality. It might be perceived as a moment at which we can retire from all the ambivalences, uncertainties, and tensions of the world. But for Nietzsche and for Zarathustra, noontide is a time to dive into sleep, which of course is also paradoxical. That's lunchtime where I'm from. But anyway, one of the sort of strange notes or grace notes, I think, within Thus Spoke Zarathustra and in the note that we see from the Wanderer in his shadow, is that the sleep Nietzsche writes about seems to happen almost instantaneously. Or at least it seems that time in the chronological sense has been suspended or altered in some way. I haven't seen much written about this point, but given that time is a Titanic notion associated with Chronos, it would make sense. The active repose of Dionysus is something that breaks us from the grip of the Titans, and that extricates us from the prison that has been created by their realized desire for revenge. And so going back to the work of Rafael Lopez Pedraza, another one of the contradictions, the paradoxes, the ambivalences that he points out is how Dionysus becomes the figure of madness. He is not only the carrier of madness, but he is also the figure that liberates us from that madness as well. Moreover, it is the figure of Dionysus himself who stands over this divide between two types of madness, two ways of pathologizing the world. And it is through Dionysus that we hold in tension a sort of clinical notion of pathology, and then a notion of pathology and suffering that Lopez Pedraza deems necessary in conjunction with the kinds of transformations that we experience throughout our lives. In Dionysus in Exile, he writes, "To enter madness, experience it, and come out of it again allows us to conceive of it as another Dionysiac initiation. According to Plato, Dionysiac madness was once one of the four divine states of possession and considered a blessing. In the Phaedrus, Socrates says, with reference to Dionysiac telestic or initiatory madness, there are two types of madness, one arising from human disease, the other when heaven sets us free from established convention. This is a very clear differentiation of Dionysiac telestic madness." So if we were to think for a moment in terms of the metaphor of individuation, at the threshold between one stage of individuation and another, there is often intense suffering before reaching the clearing of whatever the next phase might be. In fact, it is not only Lopez Pedraza who notices this distinction between a kind of titanic/heroic phase that precedes an initiation, but we also find this in the work of Deleuze in his rendering of the myth of Ariadne and Dionysus. We'll get to Deleuze's account in just one moment, but one of the things that Lopez Pedraza will leave us off with here today is that it is from the evolution of our relationship with early trauma and the traumas that we experience in our lives and the bubbling up of pathos, of pathology in the form of images, especially those images which are forced to contain seemingly contradictory desires, an irrational blend of push and pull. And for the depth psychologist, it is about diving into that image and embracing that tension, embracing that irrationality that then provokes the kind of transformation that we may feel is necessary when we are feeling stuck. Lopez Pedraza's image of psychological health or psychological well-being involves encouraging and cultivating Dionysiac initiations as they call to us, as we meet those thresholds throughout our lives. And that it's important for us to continue to propitiate constant psychic movement. He writes, "Initiation and psychic movement go hand in hand. I cannot imagine that psyche moves without the trauma of leaving behind the previous stage in which it has been involved. I see initiation as beginning in childhood, as in the mythical analogy of the Titan's dismemberment of Dionysus, and passing into other initiations, youth, puberty, adolescence, adulthood, midlife, old age, ending with the initiation into death. In other words, initiation accompanies a psychological response to each new stage in life. We know by now that psychosomatic health depends on living each stage of life physically. To fail to keep pace can mean illness or psychic stagnation. I think one of the risks of this evaluation is that it could easily lure us into the idea of a developmental narrative that would then divorce us from the immediacy of things that we see on the ground in our general psychic picture. That said, that does not undermine the fact that each one of us often goes through these kind of initiatory thresholds and then raises the question of what to do about it. The bigger risk in all of this, as Lopez Pedraza suggests, is not transforming at all, in lingering in that titanic prison, in engendering the thoughts, affects, habits, and beliefs of a stage that is ready to come to pass. Even though I don't intend to go there today, we could scale this metaphor up to society, to politics, as a way to think about imminent transformations of the political and social field. But setting that aside for now, there is one more image of Dionysian transformation that I want to talk about that I think is very profound and has what I believe is one of the most interesting interpretations of Nietzsche's work and a unique piece of philosophical creativity in its own right, which is Gilles Deleuze's essay, The Mystery of Ariadne According to Nietzsche. Now, if you are not up to speed on the myth of Ariadne, let's review it. So, many of us, when we were in elementary school, we learned about the myth of Theseus. He was the Athenian hero who sailed to Crete to slay the Minotaur, a half-man, half-bull creature who was imprisoned in the labyrinth by King Minos. Ariadne was the daughter of King Minos, and she falls in love with Theseus and helps him navigate the labyrinth by giving him a thread that would allow him to trace his way back once the deed has been done. Theseus successfully kills the Minotaur, and he escapes the labyrinth, and he leads Ariadne away with him as they flee Crete. However, on their journey home, Theseus abandons Ariadne on the island of Naxos, leaving her alone and heartbroken. And once again, we are confronted with a set of paradoxical images because there are variations of this story. In some variations of the Ariadne myth, Ariadne despairs on the island and she ends up hanging herself. In another version of the myth, she is discovered by Dionysus, whereupon Dionysus ends up taking her as his consort and brings her into the Dionysian fold, as it were. And in the end, Dionysus places her crown among the stars, creating the constellation Corona Borealis, where we can see the majesty of Ariadne today. And so the myth of Ariadne is about standing at one of these thresholds. On the one side of the threshold, we have this love for Theseus. He is the hero. He is the lover of puzzles, games, riddles. He is the slayer of monsters. But from a Nietzschean and Deleuzian standpoint, Theseus's way of affirming life is through the weight of his burdens, the burden to be the hero, to accumulate achievements, recognition, and honor. Theseus's ambitions are guided by a principle of mastery and imposing his will upon things. Ariadne falls in love with Theseus and everything he represents. However, then the question is, what does she fall in love with when she falls in love with Dionysus? He offers a very different encounter, one that does not seek to master or impose, but rather to liberate and to play and affirm life in its multiplicity. The figure of heroic love that we see in the Theseus and Ariadne dyad involves Ariadne standing at the threshold of the labyrinth, holding a thread by which Theseus is either tethered or belayed as he delves deep to the labyrinth's core to find the Minotaur, to slay it. And in this image, what we see is a kind of tension, a kind of oppositionalism, a kind of weight, burden, and an image of responsibility. Perhaps one more step that we could also take here is to imagine Ariadne's suffering and despair in the form of her hanging herself as a reflection of that image of the tethering of the hero, something that she could not let go. So the question is, what is it that Deleuze sees in the hero that is so detestable? Well, I don't think it's merely a matter of him having a distaste for heroism, because clearly in the image that Deleuze is setting up, heroic love prefigures in some sense this Dionysiac love. And what does that mean? Well, for him, the figure of the hero represents a kind of reactive power. And despite the seeming superiority of the figure of the hero, this is a figure who has internalized ressentiment, bad conscience, and there is a thread of nihilism that runs through all of the hero's exploits. The hero has a taste for taking on burdens, and many, if not all of their ambitions, are driven by an enterprise for revenge, witnessing a monster, qua monster, as a monster, and slaying it because it is a monster, it is a monstrosity. The hero is the rational agent that is divided from the irrational enemy that we see in the monster. Moreover, it is the hero's duty to himself and to others to impose his burdens upon others. Hence, he solicits Ariadne to carry the thread for him so that he can fulfill his task. We could multiply instantiations of this metaphor all day long to talk about all the kinds of resentment and bad conscience that Theseus' dynamic reflects. I will mention just one timely one. And sadly, it's going to be a tiresome and prosaic one, but one that is just too apt to pass up. So here we are in February of 2025, and we are a month into the faltering presidency of Donald Trump and his alliance with Elon Musk. And one of the things that we will hear from either one of these guys on any given day is how they are now saddled with the burden of rescuing Western civilization from the various monstrosities that afflict it, and how that they are singularly prepared to take on the burden of fulfilling this task. And by taking on this burden, they will not bring anything new into the world. They will only seek to recover something that has come to pass, even if it means bending the entire framework of the existing government to do so. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that simply engaging one's enemies makes one subject to the resentments of the heroic type, but it remains pretty clear to me that Elon Musk and Donald Trump's manifest logic for doing what they're doing, by even invoking the concept of a burden, puts them squarely in this category. Now, for Deleuze, those who wish to bear the burden, the heroic type, relate to life in a fundamentally different manner than the Dionysiac types. Theseus can only relate to the Minotaur in terms of the weight of the burden which he carries. Thus, he is forced to tame it, to subdue it, ultimately to kill it, and cannot see within the possibility of the Minotaur a kind of lightness or airiness. And so it is here where monstrosity as a kind of excess to the heroic burden becomes a metaphor for life itself. What if this irrational excess were not something to be negated? What if it were something to be affirmed? The Minotaur's relationship to the labyrinth is fundamentally different than Theseus. In fact, Theseus sees the labyrinth as a kind of prison, or even as a kind of cell of execution, and Ariadne participates in this myth by going along with his plan. And thus we have a case where the quote-unquote inferior or reactive element presents itself as a kind of superior, but for Deleuze that is not the case. He writes, quote, Theseus does not understand that the bull, or the rhinoceros, possesses the only true superiority, a light, prodigious beast deep in the heart of the labyrinth, but who also feels at ease in high places, a beast who harnesses and affirms life, end quote. For the Minotaur, the labyrinth is not the prison, it's not the oppressive place that Theseus believes it to be. Yes, it is indeed this subterranean milieu. However, the bull is free to move about. Theseus, on the other hand, tethered to Ariadne, is not. Without that oppositional tension, which keeps him tethered to the threshold of the labyrinth, he cannot enjoy the same lightness and airiness that the bull experiences. So Deleuze goes on in his text, quote, Dionysus the bull is pure and multiple affirmation, the true affirmation, the affirmative will. He bears nothing, unburdens himself completely, makes everything that lives lighter." End quote. One of the things that I've always been curious about in this particular essay is whether or not Deleuze is responding directly to the work of Georges Bataille on the concept of the labyrinth. The image and the values that Bataille espouses in letting go of Ariadne's thread is one of utter dissolution and dissipation. I believe that Deleuze has an antipathy for the kind of language that Bataille uses to describe the kind of freedom he would like to achieve in virtue of being in the labyrinth. And I'm talking specifically about the idea of losing oneself. Deleuze, on the other hand, writes at the very end of the essay, quote, "The labyrinth is no longer the path on which one gets lost, but the path that returns. The labyrinth is no longer that of knowledge or morality, but the labyrinth of life and of being as living being." And to be fair to both Deleuze and Bataille, I don't have anything direct to back this up, but it seems nonetheless somewhat well known. Even Jason Babak-Mohageg points this out in our recent Acid Horizon episode on evil, that Deleuze has an aversion to Bataille's work, maybe even an antipathy on the basis of the sort of religious accent it carries. And my claim is, if that's true, I believe some of that is appearing here, especially at the end of the essay. For Deleuze, the labyrinth is meant to be a place of life, a place of play, and the monstrosities that lurk within it are not beasts of the depths, but they are joyous and creative powers of life. These are the powers that have been alienated by the Titans in Dionysus's dismemberment. And maybe a way that we can sort of negotiate a truce between Bataille and Deleuze here is to say that, well, for Bataille, going to the very limit of our heroic energies, by going to the very limit of our ascetic tendency to construe the alienated part of ourselves as a monstrosity, and to exhaust that tendency in ourselves, seeing its upper limit, and then opening ourselves to the possibility of the affirmation of monstrosity. This is precisely what occurs in the breakdown of Theseus and Ariadne's relationship. This is the true crisis of nihilism and reactive forces having gone to their limit. Having been abandoned by Theseus on the island of Naxos, we are left with two versions of the myth, one where Ariadne hangs herself and one where she meets Dionysus and marries him. And now here's the real Deleuzian trick that happens. Which one of these myths is true? Well, the problem is that this is a false problem, and that both of these things are true simultaneously in a true Dionysian fashion. Ariadne, literally being at the end of her rope in the hanging image, shows the limit of reactive forces, and being suspended in a place where no new form of life immediately takes its place. Now, there's another telling of the myth that she actually falls asleep on the island. And once again, the image of repose or active repose comes into play. One of the interesting parallels with the story of Nietzsche sleeping at noontide is that Ariadne's paradoxical suicide and falling asleep on the island of Naxos happens when? At the hour of midnight, at the exact opposite hour of noontide. Both noon and midnight share this strange, uncanny power as being these moments in which time is either reset or suspended. Cronus's powers are breached yet again. A gap opens in titanic ressentiment, and Ariadne becomes free. In other words, the reactivity of Ariadne as a form of negation reaches its upper limit, turns upon itself to negate itself in order to affirm life. But it doesn't end there. In order for Dionysian affirmation to be complete, it must be doubled, as Deleuze says. Affirmation cannot exist in isolation. It must affirm itself again and yet again and again, and thus we have the concept of the eternal return operating as a kind of undercurrent in this story. This image of the double affirmation culminates in a sentence uttered to Ariadne by Dionysus, where he says, as Deleuze writes, "You have little ears. You have ears like mine. Put a clever word into them." And so in Deleuze's reading, the ear becomes a kind of labyrinth. I mean, if we think about it, the ear itself looks like a labyrinth, especially with its sort of maze-like contours. But this is important as an image itself because the labyrinth, once construed as this subterranean prison, but now with this image of the labyrinthine ear, the labyrinth is not something to escape, but something that is entered into which sonorous music flows, into which new rhythms enter, and it becomes the instrument of attunement to new becomings. And one of the things that I would like to emphasize is the indiscernibility or the imperceptibility of these becomings. Part of playing in the labyrinth means putting oneself in a position to be attuned to things as they are emergent, or at least leaving space for them to open up. There is another writer and depth psychologist, Christine Downing, who has an interesting personal account that I think very well captures the myth of Ariadne as it relates to Dionysian becomings. Christine Downing, like other depth psychologists, tend to think that when we have relationships with other folks, there are sort of structuring myths that we can often identify. We can see the contours, for example, of whether or not we are in a Zeus-Hera myth or whether or not we are in a Theseus-Ariadne myth. And according to Downing, she had become implicated in a friend structuring myth, one that was explicitly defined by the figure of Ariadne, and then culminated in the kind of affirmation that transcended a sense of tension or burden. Downing writes about this in her essay on Ariadne in the text Facing the Gods. She writes, quote, "Years ago, a dear friend communicated to me that I, in a way that felt very important to him, was his Ariadne. He meant by this that my being toward him as I was had given him the strength, the courage, the insight, the readiness to risk the exploration of his own labyrinth, his own soul, in a way that he felt would otherwise have been impossible. To say Ariadne was to say this more precisely and more fully than any other language available to him. It suggested also that the relationship between Theseus and Ariadne might be a paradigm for our ways not yet fully discernible to either of us." Now, I'm not sure if any of you out there have had this sort of experience in terms of a relationship or a friendship in which one of the parties felt bonded to the other person in such a way as to see them as helping them lift a kind of burden, or seeing that person as instrumental in navigating some difficulty or in a process of transformation that they were undergoing at the time. For the person being on the other side of that process, it might be pretty daunting to be pegged as the person needed to help carry that burden. As Downing suggests in her story, there was a lapse or a rift. It may have even involved a betrayal. We can imagine that if we want to. But according to her, in subsequent years, she ended up meeting up with this person again, who at the future time seemed to have transcended the specific life challenges that they had been feeling at the time at which they had said to Downing, "Look, you're my Ariadne in this situation." So just to bring back Deleuze's interpretation of the Theseus-Ariadne myth in conjunction with Downing's story, we might speculate that the person who had experienced that burden, it might be the case that they finally came to a critical limit and they surpassed whatever trial or boundary or impasse that they were experiencing at that time. And upon meeting Downing again for the second time, according to her recollection of the story, there was a new sort of lightness in that relationship. Have you ever felt anything like that? I mean, just to share something maybe a bit personal, I have had moments in my life where a particular relationship, whether it was conscious or unconscious, seemed to carry a collective burden of some kind, which made some forms of expression difficult in the context of that relationship. However, once you extricated yourself from that relationship, you created a place of stillness and calm. You got outside of that. And maybe it was even the case that you were able to set up a little bit of a psychological laboratory to complete that transformation. And then perhaps you meet again that someone from your past with whom you carried that burden, and now having a new perspective and a new sense of self, perhaps things don't seem as heavy as they used to be. After thinking about these kinds of situations for a while, it made me think that we should have a word for this phenomenon. Something that honors Dionysus and his marriage with Ariadne. And I came up with the concept of nexosis, named after the island of Naxos. And so to have a naxotic experience is to undergo this transfiguration from the heroic type, the one trapped in the Titanic prison, the one who believes that carrying a certain kind of burden or cultivating a kind of heroic endurance or revels in the idea of pressing through exhaustion, for example. This mode of life, I believe, conceals a kind of nihilism that the naxotic event negates and then turns us towards a more affirmative way of living our lives. So we had a multiplicity of players in today's discussion, including Rafael Lopez Pedraza, Friedrich Nietzsche, Gilles Deleuze, a little bit of George Bataille, and Christine Downing there at the end. And maybe just a few words to sum up. What is a naxotic transformation? Well, it is a shift from the heroic or titanic mode of life, a preoccupation with the ego, with goals, with burdens, with endurance, with one's own exhaustion, slaying the dragon, Promethean ambitions, fighting monsters, escaping prisons, escaping labyrinths, an attachment to progress, to finality, to the end of things. The Dionysian mode, on the other hand, is differentiation without teleology, without finality, equanimity amidst flux, sustaining contradictory or ambivalent tensions, a shift in perceptions that sees a prison now as a playground, the one who has seen the absolute limit of one's nihilism and chooses to negate it, also one who attunes themselves to these emergent new realities, new becomings, things that are indiscernible, currently imperceptible, and learning to enjoy their enlivening intensity in the absence of a full or complete knowledge of those things. I want to thank you once again for listening to another episode of Left Hand. If all goes well next week or the week after that, I will soon have an interview with Keegan Kjeldsen on this very topic where we hash out a little bit more what it means to live a Dionysian life and how we can live a Dionysian life, especially when things look bleak and are made to look even bleaker. If you appreciate what I'm doing on Left Hand, please support me. That means going to my Patreon. Subscribe for just $5 a month and you can get these monologues or my interviews with people like Keegan Kjeldsen, Devin Gouret, Serene Richards, Collage, and all the great people that I've had on the show so far. You can get them early access. Also in March, I will be announcing something very exciting that will be happening later this year, an artist residency held by me, but in the name of the Acid Horizon podcast, where I will be undertaking a kind of experiment of sorts and doing a workshop that blends psychogeography, creative writing, fine arts, music, and much more into a series of weekend get-togethers in State College, Pennsylvania. There's going to be more information on that soon, so stay tuned and we will talk to you again very soon. Take care.